is not enjoyable, but a topic I feel very strongly and very passionately about. Before I start, I'd like to say to all of you, I welcome your questions, but I'd like to ask that you hold your questions until I finish my presentation. So if a question comes to mind as I'm speaking with you this morning, try to remember it. And when I am finished, I hope you'll have some questions to ask. I am here today to bear witness to the Holocaust, to acknowledge and honor those individuals and their families who risked their lives to save the lives of people like myself, and to share my story with you. And I would like to begin by asking each of you to think about your lives as they are today. I'd like for you to think about your lives with your families, with your spouses, with your children or grandchildren, and any other member of your family. I'd like for you to think about your lives in terms of your careers or your businesses or being in retirement. I'd like for you to think about your lives in terms of how and where you worship. I'd like for you to think about your lives in terms of the friends you have and the time you spend with them. And having done that for just a few seconds, I now would like for you to imagine the following things happening to you. I'd like you to imagine that several months ago a new government came to power in our country, not by being elected, but by seizing complete control and power. That since that time you have seen and you have witnessed dramatic negative changes take place. You have seen certain music being banned, certain books being banned, and then thousands and thousands of those books set on fire. Those of you who have careers, you've been demoted or have lost your careers. Those of you who have businesses, your business has been vandalized and then firebombed and destroyed. Your place of worship likewise has been vandalized and then firebombed and destroyed. Friends of yours have disappeared overnight without a trace. You and members of your family have been physically attacked and beaten in the streets, and most of the population has stood by and let it happen. Imagine now some time has passed, and that one night you are awakened out of a deep sleep by some loud noise and commotion outside your home. Then there is a loud knock on your front door. You get up and you answer that knock, and you are faced and confronted by several individuals with guns pointed at you. And you are told to awaken the rest of your family, gather only those things you can carry, and that you have just a few minutes to leave your home. You ask them why. And you are told in no uncertain terms to simply do as you are told. So you do awaken the rest of your family, begin to gather items that are important to you, clothes and other things. And as you walk out the front door and adjust to the darkness outside, what you see are some trucks parked in front of your home and up and down your street. You see people like yourselves, children and babies, being forced on the back of those trucks. Unfortunately, you also see and you witness some individuals who try to resist. And you see them shot and killed in front of your eyes. So you and your family get on the back of one of those trucks. You are tired, you are angry, you are confused. And you have no idea as to what's going to happen to all of you next. But you find out in a few minutes. Because as those trucks leave the front of your home and leave your street and leave your neighborhood, they drive to the nearest railroad station. And when they get there, they drive up to a very long freight train. And now you and all the others are forced, like animals, to get into freight boxcars. As you step into your freight boxcar, you can see there is very little food, there is very little water, there are no sanitary facilities of any kind. And a freight boxcar that might hold 50 or 75 people is now crammed full with nearly 200 of you. You cannot sit down, you cannot lie down, you're forced to stand. The doors to your boxcar close and the train begins to move. It is very dark, it is very cold, it is very uncomfortable. And what you hear for the next 3 days is the cries of babies and the hysteria of some of your fellow adults. When the train finally stops and the doors to your boxcar open and you look outside for the first time in 3 days, what you see is some barren ground and some wooden buildings surrounded by high barbed wire fences. The mountains to the west you're used to seeing every day now are gone. You have no idea where you are. And once again, like animals, you are taken out of the freight boxcar that you're in, and you are marched into one of those wooden buildings. As you walk in, you can see there is very little furniture, there are very few beds, there is mostly straw on the floor. You live in this place and you survive in this place for the next 20 to 24 months. And during that time, you live on just 2 meals per day that for the most part consist of a watery soup and some bread. You see many people get sick, many of them die. But somehow, some way, you and your family do manage to survive. And then I want you to imagine, for those of you who are parents or grandparents of young children, that you are faced with a very difficult decision to make. Because there are some individuals who have come to this place whose main purpose, whose main mission, whose main goal is to rescue and save as many children and babies from this place. And the decision you have to make as a parent or grandparent is whether or not to give your young child or young children to them. Now, before I go on, the question is, did this really happen? And the answer is yes. Did this happen to a small number of people, like 50 or 100 or maybe 1,000 people? And the answer is no. This happened to millions and millions of people a long time ago, between 1935 and 1945. And then we have to ask the questions, why did this happen and how could this happen? And to answer those questions, I've got to take you way back to the end of World War I. Germany lost World War I very badly, and because of that, conditions in Germany were pretty awful. People were angry and upset. The economy was in shambles, inflation was very high, unemployment was very high. People had a very difficult time getting enough money together to buy food and clothes and other necessities. And along came a very evil young man by the name of Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler had some very strong ideas about how to solve and take care of all of Germany's troubles and problems. His ideas centered on and focused on getting rid of and eliminating all minority groups all over Germany, mainly the Jews. So he began to make very hateful, very evil speeches. Speeches that promoted discrimination, bigotry, hatred, and violence. And in the beginning, very few people listened. The crowds were very, very small. And as a matter of fact, Adolf Hitler was even arrested and put in jail because he himself got involved in violence. During the time he spent in jail, Adolf Hitler wrote a book. The book was called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. And in that book he wrote about and he outlined what he would do if he ever came to power in Germany. When he got out of jail, he went back to making those hateful, evil speeches. And unfortunately, little by little, the crowds began to grow. People began to believe in what he said. And then he formed the Nazi Party, along with 6 other evil men. A very small group of 7 people. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because those 7 evil men grew in numbers to be hundreds, and then thousands, and eventually millions of Nazis. And in less than 20 years, they had created and caused what we know today to be the Holocaust, which turned out to be the killing of more than 11 million innocent people. 11 million innocent people. Now that's a very, very large number, but if you could try to think about or possibly imagine, every one of us living in the state of Colorado today, every man, every woman, every child, every baby living in our state today, and if all of us were to die tomorrow, more than twice as many people died in the Holocaust as live in the whole state of Colorado today. Now, I said the Nazi Party began to grow in numbers. In the beginning, they also did run in local and state and national elections. In 1932, the Nazi Party got 30% of the vote in Germany. Less than half, not a majority. A man by the name of Hindenburg was elected president. President Hindenburg was not a Nazi, but he was 85 years old and in very bad health. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg made a very fatal mistake. He appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany, which gave Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party, unlimited powers. And then in August of 1934, President Hindenburg died. And Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party, seized complete control and power in Germany. And those things I mentioned to you a few moments ago began to happen. People like yourselves lost the right to vote, lost jobs, careers, businesses. People were physically attacked and beaten in the streets. And most of the German population just stood by and let it happen. And then a major event took place all over Germany on the night of November 9th and 10th, 1938. The event was called Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. On that night, several thousand homes, several hundred businesses, several hundred synagogues were firebombed and destroyed. Thousands of people were injured. Hundreds were killed. And this time the world stood by and let it happen. So why am I here this morning talking about this, and what have I got to do with any of this? Well, let me say it to you, I speak to groups like yours quite often. Although most of the time I speak with middle school and high school students, because they are the future of our country. And I do that because there are individuals and organizations in our world today, some in our own country, some in our own state, some in our own communities, who are trying to rewrite history, who would deny the Holocaust ever happened. And I'm here to say to you, it did happen. And as a very young child, I was there. I was born March 29th, 1938, in Mannheim, Germany, a very large city in the southern part of Germany. I had a younger sister born June the 4th of 1940, and it's a miracle she was even born because of the conditions that existed for Jews in Germany at that time. On October 22nd, 1940, my family got the knock on the front door I described to you a few minutes ago. My 4.5-month-old sister, my mother, my father, and I, along with hundreds of other Jews, were taken out of our home, then taken by truck to the nearby railroad station, then taken by freight train from Mannheim, Germany, to the southern part of France, to a place called Camp Gurs. Now, why France? Well, as you may recall from your World War II history, the Nazis conquered and occupied France in early 1940. And as a result, the French government, called the Vichy government, chose to assist, cooperate, and collaborate with the Nazis. And one of the things the French government did was to build a large number of holding and detention camps all over France. Places for people like us to be taken to until the Nazis could decide what to do with us next. So my family arrived by freight train at Camp Gurs on October 25th, 1940. The first winter we were there were 12,000 men, women, children, and babies in this one holding camp alone. Of those 12,000 people that very first winter, more than 1,000 died of starvation, disease, or froze to death. Somehow, some way, my parents were able to keep us alive. And I have to say to you, I have no idea how my mother kept my 4.5-month-old sister alive, but she did. We lived there, we survived there until August of 1942. Now, I said the French government chose to assist, cooperate, and collaborate with the Nazis. But there were hundreds and hundreds of French people who chose to do things differently, who chose a higher road, who chose a higher goal, who chose to risk their lives by joining an organization called the French Resistance. And one of the goals, one of the purposes, one of the missions of the French Resistance was to rescue and save as many children and babies from these holding camps. To do that, they first had to find a way to infiltrate those camps. And what they did was to pose as workers. Once they got inside those camps, they then had the much more difficult task of trying to convince people like my parents to give up their children to them to be rescued. So in August of 1942, my parents had a very difficult, a very terrible decision to make. They could choose to keep my young sister and I with them to see what would happen to all of us next. Or they could choose to give us up to complete strangers, not knowing what would happen to us, not knowing if they'd ever see us again, but hoping if they made the choice to give us up, that we'd be better off. My parents made the choice to give us up. And then the question is, did they make the right decision? And the answer is a very definite and emphatic yes. Because if they had not done that, I would not be here this morning, I would not be alive today, to talk about it. And the reason for that is that less than 1 month later, on September the 16th, 1942 to be exact, my parents, along with hundreds of others, including some children, some babies who were not given up and therefore not rescued, were put on another freight train. And this time the freight train took them from the southern part of France to Poland, to the Auschwitz concentration camp. One of the most horrendous, one of the most horrific of all the killing camps that existed all over Europe. And you have to realize, of course, that the concentration camps were not like the holding camps. In the holding camps, you had a chance to survive. In the concentration camps, the chance of surviving was very, very slim. As a matter of fact, less than 4%. Less than 4 out of 100. Less than 40 out of 1,000. And so on. The train my parents were on carried 1,003 people. Again, men, women, some children, some babies who had not been given up and therefore not rescued. It arrived at Auschwitz on September the 18th, 1942. By January 27th, 1945, when Auschwitz was liberated from just that one train alone, of those 1,003 people, only 38 were still alive. 965 had died from just that one train alone. Now you try to think about or imagine hundreds and hundreds of such trains arriving at different concentration camps all over Europe, all of the time, and you get some idea of where the 11 million innocent people comes from. As these trains arrived, one of the first things that people sometimes heard was a small band playing at the station, which is ridiculous and absurd, but true. The first thing that people saw when they got out of the freight boxcars this time were Nazi officers or doctors standing on a platform, pointing to the left or pointing to the right. Now, what did that mean? And let me say to you, this is difficult to talk about. It may be hard for some of you to hear, but because it happened and because it's true, I have to share it with you. If you were sent to the left, you were usually under the age of 12 or 13, or over the age of 55 or 60, or you looked to be in bad health, or you might have a physical handicap, or maybe, just maybe, the Nazi officer or doctor just didn't like your looks. If you were sent to the right, you were usually over the age of 12 or 13, under the age of 55 or 60, looked to be strong, looked to be healthy, looked to be able to do a very hard day's work. Now, this is the hard part. And remember that I, as a 4.5-year-old child, my sister, as a 2.5-year-old, were not on that train. If you were sent to the left by a Nazi doctor, what that meant was that you were going to have medical experiments performed on you without anesthetics. If you were sent to the left by a Nazi officer, it meant you would die that day. And the first thing that happened to you was all of your hair was shaved off, all of your clothes were taken away, and you were made to feel subhuman, just like an animal. And then they played a horrible trick on you by telling you to be sure and watch where your clothes were hung, so you came out of the showers when you did, you'd find your clothes. Only the showers were not showers. They were gas chambers. And instead of water coming out of the faucets, gas spewed out. And within minutes, people died a horrible, horrible death. If you were sent to the right, you were given a chance, at least for a while, to survive in Auschwitz. And if you were very lucky and you had some musical talent, you might even get a chance to play in that small band to welcome future trains. Which again is ridiculous and absurd, but true. Or you might get to be a seamstress or a carpenter or a janitor or some such job. But for most of those sent to the right, that is not what they had to do. They now lived on just one meal per day that for the most part consisted of a watery soup and some stale bread. The kinds of jobs they had to do were to dig mass graves, to pull the dead bodies out of the gas chambers and throw them in those graves, and much, much worse.